Thanks very much. So I tend to wander, and so I won't stand there. And I've got quite a lot of content, and so I won't give you my history and other things, and I'm quite happy to chat with people afterwards if you wanted to know that. So the organisers, thanks for coming along, thanks to the organisers. They gave me the broad topic, and the slightly smaller font, the 3 doses of healthy skepticism, is what I added without them asking for it, and so we'll see how successful that is. So I'm going to go through 3 things, and then actually in the third I'm going to go through another 3, so if I said 6 it would already scare you off. And so the 3 things are, pre-COVID our performance was mediocre. It wasn't disastrous. Disastrous was Argentina and Uruguay, who were our peers 120 years ago, but it was mediocre. The COVID shock is especially to economies who specialise in services, and despite export education and despite tourism, that's not us. Okay, we specialise in agriculture, and so all else the same, irrespective of policy responses, we would have expected an economy like New Zealand to not do as badly as many other economies did. Okay, I tend not to focus on policy makers. I focus on policy because sometimes things get, the policymaker is hero or the policymaker is naive if someone doesn't like Trump and so forth, and it misses the deeper fundamentals. And so that's what I want to be able to focus on here. And then the 3 reasons for skepticism, and without being too ungreen, I'm going to twist the fern, which is just blocking my screen. It's plastic, I think, so I wouldn't have broken it anyway. And so the first thing, and it seems a bit of a strange thing to say, from Ganesh's talk, and a lot of people said, well, is Zoom going to save us? And I'd actually put that into my slides before I knew that we were part on Zoom. And I would say no. We've seen this about 20 years ago. A lot of work on economic distance. The world is flat, according to Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, and the death of distance, according to Frances Cairncross of The Economist, daughter of the very, very famous Scottish economist, Sir Alec Cairncross. And it was actually a former colleague here, Phil McCann, who pointed out that actually it's not, the world is curved, it's not flat, distance matters more than ever, and so it wasn't such a big puzzle for why New Zealand wasn't doing so badly, despite having quite good policies at the time, because face-to-face communication, the sort of things which occur in cities, became more important, not less. And so I'll spend a little bit of time on that, but not too much, because it's not my work. I'll then talk about human capital, and we've got particularly large intergenerational, but also inter-ethnic issues. I won't say problems, but I'll say issues here, and so the particular response that New Zealand took is putting burdens onto particular generations and particular ethnic groups, and I'm not sure that that's an ideal one. And I'll also talk at the end, and this will get, the PR people will start to shift uneasily on their seats, because I'll talk about one of the 2 inevitabilities of life, and I'm not going to talk about taxes. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about death. Okay, and I'm going to point out that our response to risk was probably inefficient, probably inequitable, and what I should have added here as well is it seemed fairly arbitrary, and so it increases the uncertainty going forward. It's a deterrent to people's investment from the way we've done things now. Okay, so go very quickly. And Grant Scobie, I'm very pleased to see Grant here 30 years ago when I first came to Waikato. We had exactly this diagram, and it's about the competition for resources in an economy, and at that stage, the issue was that New Zealand was still supporting the importables sector. The Reserve Bank also did work on this. So roughly for every 10 percentage point protection given to the importable sector, about 70% of that flowed back into the non-traded goods sector, and the characteristic of non-traded goods is that their prices are set domestically. They have captive consumers, and so if there's a demand increase for there, then they can simply increase the price. The tradable sector, which is exportables plus importables, have their prices set on the world market. And what has been the structure, I should say too, these, even though I've used black lines here, it's a bit fuzzy. So technology, back office operations, Zoom, remote medicine, all sorts of things move the line. Things that used to be not tradable can be tradable, and so the tradable sector seems to get a bit bigger, but the bigger effect is the green arrow. The demand effect, as we get richer, we demand more services and we demand more non-traded things like property, and so the non-traded sector is much bigger in richer countries. And so the dominant effect is going to be the green rather than red. Now, as many people know, in New Zealand, almost all of our growth over the last 2 decades has occurred in the non-traded part of the economy. And the problem for that from a productivity point of view is that the non-traded part of the economy can operate by and large with captive consumers. Wellington's going to put its rates up for 10% or whatever because they didn't look after the pipes. You can't do anything about it unless you move to Auckland, and then you're going to have high rates there, or unless you move overseas. You can't import from Amazon or from someone else a substitute for non-traded goods and services. But you can, if your local bookseller is selling the prices for too high, you just go onto Amazon and onto UShop, right? And so there's a fundamental difficulty in getting productivity growth in the non-traded sector of the economy because they don't have the spur of international competition, which applies in the traded sector of the economy. And so, as I said down here, and many other people than me have pointed this out, this is going back to 1991 indexing there, and this is in per capita terms, and this is production GDP. And so through until the late 90s, the non-traded, the red, hopefully no colorblind people here. I know Illinois at Victoria is, and so I shouldn't use colors and things. The traded part has basically been static for 20 years. The non-traded part has increased by about 70%. Okay, so that's using Stats NZ data. If we use OECD data, then export volumes in New Zealand over the last 20 or so years have grown by less than 2% per annum. We often compare ourselves to Australia. Michael Cullen used to point out, well, Australia can dig itself up and export the iron ore and so forth. Australia's exports are growing much faster than ours at the same rate as the OECD. The more sensible comparison in many ways is to small OECD countries, because small countries need to trade much more because they can't produce everything locally, and the small OECD countries have export growth of 5% per year. And so these are countries between 1 million and 8 million. So it excludes Iceland, it excludes Sweden, but it's got the Baltics, it's got the other Scandinavians, it's got Slovenia, Slovak Republic, and so forth. Okay. It doesn't have Singapore because, again, that's a special case. This is using World Bank data, because I'm not a mercantilist. The point of exporting is so that we can buy imports, and so this is exports plus imports relative to GDP from the World Bank, and so we're always the black line here, the right coloured choice to choose for New Zealand. So we went from basically 1.5 times the OECD average, slightly more relative to Australia, to now being below the OECD average, and the comparator group of countries, the small OECD countries, increased their tradables share, imports plus exports to GDP, by about 20 percentage points. So you might say, well, of course, we're not going to have as much trade as them because they're in Northern Europe or in the Northern Hemisphere, so that would be the level effect that you see on the vertical axis, but that shouldn't account for the change in the trends. There's a fundamentally different trend going on here. Okay, all right. Okay, so that was the mediocre performance, and sorry, because there's obviously a lot of people here who have been involved in economic policy over this period. It's not a criticism of individuals, but we need to point out that we haven't actually done as well as we sometimes think. Now, in order to think about how we would respond to a shock like COVID, it helps to go back to first principles. And so if we think of how the economy is organized into sectors, agriculture, industry, and services, well, agriculture, the key part of production for almost all forms of agriculture, except for intensive glass houses and except for horticulture and vertical farming in cities, is space. Okay, space is a key input into production. Workers are dispersed, and buyers and sellers are normally also spatially dispersed. Apart from going to a farmer's market, most people eating their food never know the person who grew their food. Industry is a bit harder. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, because Wuhan is central to automobile supply chains, and there was actually quite a lot of disruption to supply chains in other countries, and often the assembly line production takes some additional changes, and so PPP put in place, plastic shields, robots, sanitizing robots, etc. But by and large, industry also has coped pretty well. Again, when is the last time any of us ever went to the factory to buy something? We never do. So buyers and sellers for industrial goods are, again, separated by a long distance. Services is totally different. Services traditionally requires face-to-face, and so when we look, for example, at agglomeration economies, which is the amount by which bigger places are more productive or pay higher wages, that almost always comes through the services sector. It doesn't come through manufacturing. It certainly doesn't come through agriculture. Indeed, one of the main explanations we have for the existence of cities, why put up with the congestion in Wellington or in Auckland, is because of the productivity advantage of having more direct face-to-face communication with your input suppliers, your colleagues, your collaborators, and also the direct matching of buyers and sellers, because most services require you experience them, they take time to do. So all else the same, we would expect economies who rely on services to do pretty badly. And this is from the January, it's the most recent World Economic Outlook of the IMF. It doesn't include New Zealand because it only includes the 30 countries which contribute the biggest share of world GDP, which is 83%. But you see very clearly that for every additional 5% increase in the share of services and GDP in 2019, the real GDP growth rate in 2020 dropped 1 percentage point, okay? And you'll say, oh, okay, well, look, US, UK, Spain, those are rich. Indonesia, India, Egypt, China, those are poor. Is it being driven by income? You get exactly the same relationship if you condition on GDP of these countries as well. For agriculture, it's exactly the opposite. For every 5 percentage point increase in the share of agriculture in GDP, then GDP growth in 2020 was 1% higher than it otherwise was. So the shock was not as big as it would be. So where's New Zealand? Well, New Zealand has GDP as 6% coming from the agricultural sector versus the OECD average of 1%. So we've already got a 5 percentage point gap, which would account already for 1 percentage point more growth in New Zealand than we expected, irrespective of whether we had good or bad policy responses, right? Just due to our economic structure. And so we, luckily, in this period, specialized in the sector which can most easily cope with social distancing. That's exactly what life on the farm is. It's a lot of real estate to go and do things. And the sector which can least easily cope is services, and despite export education and despite tourism, we're not a services-intensive economy compared with most other rich countries. Okay, so does this herald a new dawn? And quite a lot of writing has come out in the COVID era saying, well, you know, there's all sorts of other problems, climate change and so on and so forth. We need to reshape the economy, reset the economy and so forth. As I said here, will Zoom save us because we'll have ongoing social distancing, we'll have some decline in face-to-face services, will remoteness become an advantage if we could ever get the border properly managed? My view, no. Okay, skeptically, my view is no. Okay, and so our pre-COVID mediocrity will return, but in addition, our COVID response has opened up new vulnerabilities which weren't there pre-COVID. Okay, and so we've got new problems to grapple with because of our particular response to this shock. Okay, so let me go through, and just 2 slides on this before I go to the 2 in a little bit more detail. So as I said, 20 years ago, there was this belief that the world was becoming flat because IKEA and Amazon and everyone else who's got a really efficient supply chain could send goods and some services, back office operations around the world really cheaply. How am I doing for time, Matt? Cool, okay, so then I'll give a little, My current house is made out of an entire container load of building material, which I imported from British Columbia for $4,000, not for buying the materials, shipping it from British Columbia, from Vancouver to Busan to Tauranga. It cost me almost as much to get it from Tauranga to Clare to Mirror Ridge and to get it to Hamilton and then to my rental property. So things that are relatively standardized, containerization, information and so forth, become really, really cheap, okay, and really efficient. And so the argument is, well, the cost of engaging in activities across space, so trying to build your house across space or buying materials across space in my case, has fallen, so remote places should be less disadvantaged. And this is what then caused puzzles for people, and Phil McCann, when he was here, wrote a lot on this. People were puzzled. Well, we should be becoming closer now, and we've got good policies, and so why is our productivity so badly? Why is our tradable sector shrinking so much? And so Phil's answer, and I think it's the right one, is that it ignores complementarities. This story is all about substitution, and the way I'm going to explain it is it's akin to the lump of labor fallacy. And those of you, many of you will know, the lump of labor fallacy is the idea there's a given stock of jobs to do. Something threatens those jobs, such as a machine, so Ludd and the other Luddites go and smash the machine, or something threatens those jobs because there's more productive workers, such as RSE workers coming from the Pacific to pick horticultural crops who are about 30 to 40% more productive than the New Zealand workers. And so the dominant story is about substitution. The reality is, the machine comes, we become more productive. When we're more productive, we're richer. When we're richer, we demand more goods and services. And so in the long run, both the machine and the more efficient labor from abroad are complements rather than substitutes. And the reason why over 2 centuries we got much richer isn't because we kept on looking for better and better substitution possibilities, but doing fundamentally the same thing. It's because of the opportunities provided by complementarity. Now, so keep that story in mind, and let me go to the next slide. And there's the triple asterisks because it's so important here. This is Phil McCann's answer, okay? Despite the fact that shipping a package with Amazon or from IKEA or me shipping my building materials across the oceans has got much cheaper, spatial transactions costs have actually risen because with better information technologies, we demand more. The quantity, variety, and complexity of the knowledge that is communicated rises, and much of this is non-standard and tacit, so it requires face-to-face, and so there is a premium on location. There's not a penalty for central location, there's a penalty remaining for remoteness. And this is the same issue. And so, yes, Zoom will make us more productive. Because we're more productive, we'll be richer. Because we're richer, we're going to demand more of everything, and one of the things we like is travel and meeting people and so on and so forth. So I don't see this as a fundamental reset. I don't see this as a substitution. It's the complementarity which is going to be the key thing here, okay? So others may disagree, but that's my take on it. Okay, so the vulnerabilities we've opened ourselves up to. So just as a little primer, and the expert on this is sitting in the middle of the room, so human capital in New Zealand is worth about 3 times the value of physical capital, and it's risen over time. And human capital, when these calculations are made, is simply the expected discounted value of lifetime earnings, allowing for the risk of death and the risk of unemployment, and also allowing for the age cohort earnings growth, which we would expect to occur. So you can immediately see that a pandemic is going to affect human capital because it increases the risk of death. This particular pandemic is not going to have much effect on human capital because the mortality is so skewed towards the elderly. I used Australian data because we don't present point data for the deaths in New Zealand that I've seen, but it's going to be very much the same. So in Australia, 93% of the COVID deaths are aged 70 or older. And so there's very little direct effect on human capital. Jeffrey Rice's book, Black November, tells us about 6,000 people dying in the Spanish flu, and the median age was 30 to 35. That affects human capital, okay? COVID directly doesn't affect human capital. Indirectly, it has a huge effect because of the response to COVID, not because of COVID per se. And so the indirect effect comes from closing schools and replacing in-person learning with what is a very imperfect substitute, which is remote learning. So in the US, the San Francisco Fed calculated just last month that in 25 years' time, US output will be half of a percentage point lower because of the impairment to human capital that's occurred during this period. And it's not an even impairment. McKinsey calculate that by June 2021, so US schools by and large shut March last year, so they've gone 15 months without school. They have pretty big summer holidays over there. For students of color, and this is predominantly black students, they will have lost up to 12 months of learning. Okay, so over those 15 months, they've only had about 3 months net of learning. There's a loss also for white students, but it's only about half as large. And so the loss is disproportionately borne by poorer, browner, blacker, migrant students than by white, richer students, okay? And there's all sorts of reasons why we expect this to occur. Now, in New Zealand, we had earlier return to face-to-face learning. We had lots of innovative things. We had, I think, Susie Cato and that back on TV talking to children through this, all sorts of educational things. The university pulled out all the stops, as did all the other institutions. But there is no denying the fact that it is an imperfect substitute, because if it was better, we would already have been doing it. Okay, it's because we were forced to do remote learning that we did it. So in New Zealand, we already had big issues in human capital between ethnic groups. And so normally, when we see the correlation between people who've got more education and higher wages or higher earnings, we don't know, is it because the educators have actually caused that, we've given them more human capital? We hope that's true. That's what we comfort ourselves with when we look back on our careers. Or instead, is it simply the fact that there are already pre-existing differences in productivity which couldn't be known unless you had some way to signal it by accumulating a credential? And so that's more of a bleak story, because all we're doing is giving a piece of paper to certify that this person was productive and this was not. It turns out there is a remarkable difference between European Pakeha and Maori Pacific in these relationships. And so normally in New Zealand, because the census and the surveys only ask about highest qualification, we can't unpack this difference. But there was a survey a few years ago which asked both about the number of years and also the pieces of paper, the credentials collected along the way. So this is for people like me. This is for European Pakeha. And so if it's not very clear, this is years of education. So below 9 is the omitted category. That's pre-high school, basically. And it goes all the way up to 21 plus. If you've got a PhD, it's more like 25 or 26. It's probably bending over. They've got earnings which are 50% greater, conditional on qualifications. If we didn't condition on qualifications, it would be 100% greater, which is why I said it's about half and half for European Pakeha for the returns to human capital versus the returns to signaling and credentialing. For Maori and Pacific, just check I haven't gone backwards before, this might end in disaster. No, good, it didn't. For Maori and Pacific, the return is entirely to credentials. And particularly, it's to credentials with postgraduate. And so if you're Maori and Pacific and you've got postgraduate, then you've got a far bigger percentage increase in earnings than would be the case for Pakeha. But the labour market, for whatever reason, whether it be because there was not, in fact, human capital going on in the schooling system, or it wasn't being recognised, for whatever reason, the labour market for Maori and Pacific looks like that. It's totally flat. Now, this is survey data. Hopefully someone will go into the integrated data infrastructure and do it with 1 million observations, and the standard errors, which are the brown bars, will get smaller, but it's a fundamentally different pattern, okay? And it's obviously an individual tragedy, it's a community tragedy, but it's an aggregate tragedy because by 2038, the Pacific share of the population grows 40%, the Maori share grows by 25%, Pakeha share is down 12%. About 40% of children in school in 2038 are Maori and Pacific. And if it is truly the case that their human capital wasn't being recognized or wasn't actually being formed in the usual circumstances, then how much worse is it going to be in the remote learning circumstances where the resources available to them typically were much worse, right? So that's a really big problem. And we've pushed a lot of adjustment onto this generation. Okay, so last one, okay? Anyone here ever been to the World Bank headquarters in Washington? Do you know what's carved on the stone in the front? Our dream, a world free of poverty. It's the World Bank mission statement, right? Right thing. This should be carved in the front of the Ministry of Health building in Wellington, right? If we misperceive risk and we invest excessively in reducing some risks, then what we do, and this is Viscusi, who's the grandfather of all economic approaches to risk analysis, we pay more than we should for health gains that are less than we could achieve, right? If we get the balance wrong, we pay more than we should for health gains that are less than we can achieve, right? I'm going to argue that's probably what we've done on COVID. I know not everyone here is going to agree on it. The larger problem is that the sort of analyses to work out whether we paid more than we should haven't been done. The decisions have been made without going back to a framework for decision-making for risk under uncertainty. And that seems to be a huge risk going forward because that's where the arbitrariness can come in. Okay, so there's, to put it bluntly, 3 broad ways we can respond to a new risk to human health. Some people are going to get sick and some people are going to die. So there's a morbidity and a mortality response. We can forego current output in order to increase safety. Okay, shelter at home, spend a lot of money, which we didn't used to spend on hand sanitizer and on PPP and things like that. And the third one, which is less commonly discussed in the literature, is we can kick the can down the road because we can borrow, and so our descendants will have some call on their future output in order that we buffer our consumption while we reduce output. Okay, so we're going to push some of the adjustment potentially onto the future. Okay, so this is the DEF output debt triangle, and we've got a scale here because we actually have well-established things for working out how much weight to put on this. And so for DEF versus output, we've got the value of statistical life and we've got quality-adjusted life years. For output debt, it's not quite right. It's more output now or consumption now, consumption in the future, the interest rate and the rate of time preference. The third leg is not really talked about very much, and so I'll be welcome for people to suggest better, but I would suggest the following. The debt service ratio, how much of the future output is not available to the future generation because it's repaying the debt that we use to keep our consumption high, multiplied by the income elasticity of life expectancy. Okay, and I'll talk about the income elasticity of life expectancy a little bit. It's basically the idea that in richer time periods, in richer societies, and within societies for richer groups, life expectancy is higher. And the reason we don't spend all of the output in making things totally safe is that is perverse because we destroy so much output that we actually increase mortality rather than decreasing it. And there's lots of papers on that. Okay, so New Zealand's approach of the bottom trade-off, of the DEF output trade-off, and it's not quite value of statistical life, in most cases it's been quality of life years. Martin Lally, formerly at Victoria, has done the most on this. He's done it ex post and ex ante in all sorts of different ways and finds that the implied value of lives saved or life years saved from the response to COVID were about 40 times existing benchmarks used by Pharmac or used by Ministry of Transport, okay? Heatley at the Productivity Commission, which really was done as a primer for Treasury and for others as to how we could do this, but it's now published in New Zealand Economic Papers, looked at the level 4 extension of 5 days last April, looked at the quality adjusted life years that were saved by that under epidemiological models versus those that were cost, and the costs were 100 times the benefits. And then Ian Harrison, who looked only at construction, which again, this is where our small-scale building actually would have been a help because there's not a whole bunch of people in a factory. It's 2 guys, typically 2 guys, holding up some pre-cut stuff, so they're distanced by about 4 or 5 meters, and Ian calculated that the costs were about 300 times the benefits, right? The particular values are not super important. The fact that these sorts of analyses were by and large entirely absent from the public sector, the Ministry of Health, the Treasury didn't do them, or certainly didn't publicise them, and people have put in OIAs and haven't found them, is the bigger worry. Because it means that we can do these same sorts of decisions again in the next crisis, and we don't have any framework for making difficult choices. Okay. So this is a bit small from the back, I apologize. This is from the short-term mortality forecast database, a fluctuation database, not forecast. This is total deaths. This is not COVID deaths. This is total deaths week by week. And so from week 1 of the year to week 52 of the year. Blue is periods where in 2020, total deaths in that week, or the total death rate, was below the long-run average, which was the average from 2010 to 2019. And normally in New Zealand, deaths peak in July, and I show you the 2017 flu season, where the death rate peaked at around about 950 per 100,000. The remarkable thing about the top diagram is that New Zealand overall for 2020 has no excess mortality at all. And so facing this difficult trade-off here, there is no work at all going on in this leg over here. All of the work is going to go on to the output and the debt legs, but not onto the death and mortality leg. We're not the only country. Norway has the exact same pattern as well. But most countries around the world, and I use Finland as an example, show either somewhat higher excess mortality, which is the orange, and so the mortality rate in 2020 was above the average for the last 10 years in that particular week, or show considerable peaks. And so the UK, Scotland shows up in this, and so a big peak in April. Slovenia shows a big peak towards the end of the year, for example. So we have no excess mortality last year. And so instead, what did we do? We went big on debt. So this is from the IMF. This is the fiscal monitor of January 2021. We have the largest response of any advanced country, so that makes it likely we have the largest response of any country because the lower income countries generally are not going to have the ability to take on debt. And in particular, if you compare to our small OECD comparison group, we're about 4 times as large response to taking on debt, okay? And so we can then do a triangle, and so this is one of these diagrams where you want to be close to the origin. Getting to point 1, everything's scaled to 1 and the 3 legs, is being worst in class. And these are the codes for the small OECD countries from Denmark through to Slovenia again. New Zealand is always black because of the All Blacks. And so our triangle is right on the origin for death. Only Norway had a smaller mortality change in 2020 than we did amongst this group of countries. We have the 3rd biggest output decline, and we have easily the biggest increase in debt, okay? So there's trade-offs involved. We can find a country, for example, Norway dominates us totally. It's got a it's closer to the origin in all 3 dimensions. And so sometimes there's a lot of, best in class, didn't we do well, et cetera, et cetera. I think that revolves around people simply not looking broadly enough at the information out there. So our response is really skewed to debt, and it's somewhat skewed towards mortality. Okay, so what are the implications of this? Well, again, we were faced with a brand new risk. There's 3 broad ways we could respond. We only used 2 of them. This raises the possibility in future, well, what happens when the next brand new risk comes along? Will we do the same? Will we do this for flu season every winter, right? We already go back. My students hate it when I go forward and back, but you see the 2017 flu season peak was about 30% higher than the 2020 COVID peak, right? Is that the right response to risk? Because in 2017, we weren't doing any of these particular things. And no, I'm not a just the flu person, but these are what the data show us here, right? So that's the first thing. The second one, actually, I need to go back again. Sorry, I should think more clearly. Look at the blue. So we're below average in 2020. We can't stay below average every year. Averages don't work that way. Most other countries who are contemplating opening up had above average mortality in 2020, and so they are likely to have a below average mortality in 2021 and 2022, irrespective of whether it's due to the vaccine or due to the cruel fact that some people who might otherwise have died in 2022 died in 2020. In contrast, we've got people who didn't die in 2020, and I can imagine the newspaper headline, economists says more people should have died in 2020. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm simply pointing out that an implication of our approach is that we had below average mortality below our own average. We cannot keep that up forever and a day. It must become above average at some stage, and it's highly likely that that will be coincident with tentative steps to open up the economy to the rest of the world, and one could imagine a considerable amount of backtracking and backsliding because of that. Whereas other countries, even if their steps are not super successful, even if the vaccines are not as good as advertised, they will not have that problem because, unfortunately, and it seems harsh to say it, but people died in 2020 who otherwise would have died in 2021, 2022, okay? Just as, and I know I can't take too much of your patience by giving another aside, but some of you will have seen last week that the CDC in the US announced that COVID had reduced life expectancy by 1 year. Well, they assume that the pattern of mortality in 2020 applies every year for 60, 70 years into the future for a hypothetical cohort born in 2020. So in their case, you can be above average every year by that reasoning. If we do the more reasonable thing of looking at people alive at the start of 2020, how many years of life did the whole US population expect to live? How many years were lost? Take the ratio of those, it's 5 days. Okay, so the average impact on life expectancy of COVID in the United States was 5 days spread across everyone, right? And so again, an understanding of relative risk seems to have been lost here. Okay, so our debt-intensive response is going to burden the next generation and potentially creates perverse impacts on life expectancy. Actions to save lives can end up costing lives, okay? And so this relies on the fact that across space, across time, within countries, there's a very, very strong relationship between income, in this case GDP, and life expectancy. In the New Zealand case, it's 50% larger than most other rich countries. And so this is a general example of us doing a lot with a little. We have a really high Human Development Index ranking, even though our GDP ranking is pretty low. But the problem is that that means that reductions in future output are going to have particularly large impacts on life expectancy here, which they won't in other places. And so last year at the time of the pre-FU, I ran the calculations based on the forecast path of output. I know things have recovered a bit since then. And we would have more than 10 times reduction in life expectancy from lower future output than would have occurred from a reasonable mitigation strategy. Again, it's a trade-off, right? It may be a trade-off that everyone's happy about, but it's a trade-off which hasn't been terribly widely brought out. So I know I've gone past 20 minutes. So let me finish with just the last bullet point, which is that from my point of view, the discussion in New Zealand has been remarkably free of consideration of these sorts of trade-offs. Okay, my hope is that this one-day forum will at least make up for a late start in bringing us somewhat more into the trade-off space. So thank you very much.
We're good. Brilliant. Thank you, John. I'll just stand here. Yeah. So I'll just check first. We'll go to the room first. Are there any questions? Yes, we've got a mic for Eric at the front of the room, and then I'll go online.
Superb job as usual, John. That is great. A couple of quick questions, if I might. One reason that we might think that this time is different around remote stuff, a lot of changes got bedded in this time around ability to work remotely and have some of those complementarities at a distance that would have been really difficult to achieve otherwise. They were forced to take on some of these fixed costs that could potentially sustain itself. Now, you're never going to get the new connections being built that way, but you should be able to maintain existing ones a lot better, so you'd think that there'd be opportunities for people to remote work from New Zealand getting paid by their American employers, and you could start thinking about that as a potential new growth area for us if we look a bit attractive. The second, so I was wondering whether you think that there's any chance of that. Is it like a 1 chance in 3, 1 chance in a million? Kind of where on the scale would you be betting on that? Second question is on your death and GDP stuff. One of the problems that I'd had with some of the analysis that had been done previously is around the counterfactuals, and you made a really good point about the share of the services economy as mattering substantially in this. Have you seen anybody put out a reasonable counterfactual forecast of what New Zealand's GDP would have been if we had been as COVID impaired as everywhere else, taking into account that different industrial structure?
Okay. Shall I answer each one? Okay, so for the first one, short answer, I think it's entirely possible that people could remote work from New Zealand overseas. The problem is, and I was tempted to add a fourth vulnerability, is we've moved from an area of price-based to non-price-based. So we don't know what the shadow value of an extra spot in MIQ is, right? And the idea that prices convey information has either been never learned, and if so, then my colleagues and I in the university sector deserve a good kicking, or else has been unlearned, because before I came here 30 years ago, I was working at Lincoln with Tony Rayner and Ralph Lattimore, and what we were looking at was the tarification of the import licensing regime, because we had protection from import licensing, which we had no idea how much it was, because it was non-price-based. And one of Muldoon's small dipping his toe into the liberalisation waters was starting to auction those off in 1982, which led to the Syntec report and these huge protective. And we are basically in exactly the same setting now, Eric, is that we don't know what value to place on MIQ spaces. We don't know what value should be expanding them or not, and who's got the highest value for them. And again, just seems to be a natural one for using price-based systems. And so I know that's not answering your question because I don't know the forecast, but it allowed me to subtly bring in the fourth point I would have made, and I didn't collude with Eric to do it either. So.
Thanks. Thank you. One from the phones or the live stream. Has any empirical work been done around the developed world measuring the impact of enforced time away from school during lockdown? And then there was another question about comparing a New Zealand experience. Obviously, we went through a different experience over the last years versus, say, the US.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of work coming out of the US where I would, for people unfamiliar, Emily Oster has done a particularly large amount of work in the US in arguing that schools should be reopened as soon as possible and shouldn't have closed. The very sad story just came out of Sweden, I think yesterday or the day before. A pediatrician working at the Karolinska Institute, who was also studying the impact of schools being closed and was arguing for schools being opened. And even though we think of Sweden as this uber-rational place which adopted this cold, heartless approach, and that chap has been so vilified online that he's moved his research away from doing this. Okay, and so just saw it yesterday, right? So this has become, the problem with this particular virus has become incredibly politicized, right? And so rational discussion about some of these things is just been impossible in ways which, for example, the 57 or the 68 pandemics didn't occur in the same sort of environments, and yet in aggregate probably are more of, this is much more like them than it is ever like 1918. So, yeah. So I'd say look first to Emily Oster.
Thank you. You touched a little bit about replacement of skills and so on. There was a question came through. What's your view on the ideal immigration settings in order for us to grow productivity, well-being in a post-COVID world?
So I sort of alluded when talking about the lump of labour idea. I do quite a lot of work with, or historically over the first 10 years of the RSE, those of you who don't know the abbreviation, the seasonal work scheme that brings in people from the Pacific Islands to pick and prune and pack and so forth. And what we see there, and that was a scheme that was up to about 14,000 workers per year by 2019. So about 0.4% of the New Zealand workforce was an RSE worker. It's actually a non-trivial amount. The evidence of that is that by and large it led to complementarity effects. The growers expanded their outcomes and they hired more New Zealand workers. And so there was a report done by the Productivity Commission, I think it was Chapter 5, which basically was all dominated by substitution. This is bringing in cheaper workers, and so if we shut that off, it will increase the demand for local workers. This, by and large, doesn't happen. I think I saw 58 workers had been hired by some scheme to move people out there. The problem is that workers come in all different shapes and sizes and locations. We've got hundreds and hundreds of labour demand curves and hundreds of labour supply curves. And the fact that there are jobs over in the Hawke's Bay at these particular months of the year doesn't really help someone who's unemployed in Hamilton or Auckland or somewhere like that. The great thing I think about the RSE was it built into the complementarity of our comparative advantage. And so I did calculations which showed that New Zealand exports were about $1 billion a year higher because of the RSE. Now, I can't say that's the same for all migration streams. I'd be quite happy if all migration streams did have to go through a cost-benefit analysis of the kind that the RSE has gone through to then work it out, because there is a lot of belief or debate that too much migration has been the driving force. If we can buzz all the way backwards, one, can we? No, two, I can't do it, they turned it off. But this divergence between the non-tradables and tradables, one hypothesis is that too much migration. My hypothesis would be to look at the 2002 Local Government Act, which gave general competence to local authorities, and so there would be a huge expansion in the range of things they did, and probably not doing some of the core things they should be doing, like depreciating the pipes. But again, that's a backward-looking thing, not a forward-looking thing.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? There's a lot come through online. Yes, we can get a microphone down here.
Thank you for your insights there, Professor Gibson. I'm just interested in you're talking about the pre-existing gaps from an ethnic basis. I suppose I'm a little bit interested in some of the solutions that are being thrown around at the moment as to try and alleviate that issue, where quite a significant portion of the workforce will be Māori Pacifica, and there'll be a little bit of a decline from the Pakeha subset as well. So are you able to give us some insights on some solutions perhaps in that space?
Solutions, no. It's in truth, I'm not an educational economist. I sometimes do labour economics, and so finding this sort of pattern is sort of, this will sound like a cop-out, I'm sure, is part of my job. Other people then responding to the pattern as to what was going on, okay? So I don't know what is the way to deal with it. I don't know, is it coming entirely from the employers? Is it an employer bias, what I called in that article statistical discrimination? Or is it a fundamental problem of the human capital production function just not working very well for whatever reason for Maori and Pacifica, and perhaps for immigrant children as well? I don't know. We don't have them there. I don't know. But certainly that seems to be something which should be front of mind for people who are researching in that area.
Thank you. I think a last question then before we break. You made a critical point that, in echoing, I guess, what I opened with, we're 1 year on now from that whirlwind of activity where there just wasn't time to do a lot of the analysis. I think a theme of these 2 days is that we have time, we have to take time, we have to bring that rigour in. How do you, and there was a question came through over Slido, how do you see the government agencies, Productivity Commission, Treasury, others, bringing more rigour and more trade-off analysis? What's the right way to get that into the policy discussion?
Well, we had pre-existing, I guess I'll say benchmarks. Rules is too strong of a word. We've been historically very strong in the area of macro rules rather than discretion. So the Reserve Bank Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. We don't seem to have the same constraint in terms of either regulatory or safety or public health, and perhaps if we did, because we had guidelines for, Pharmac every day is having to make really difficult decisions on funding things. The people building safer roads are making difficult decisions of prioritization. We had these. It's the fact that these basically, as I see it, and I might be wrong, and I apologize in advance if anyone in the room or online was part of this and it seems like a criticism, they basically went out the window. Right? They basically were not either adhered to or called up, either ex ante or even ex post. And it's not clear. There doesn't seem to be, just as there doesn't seem to be a terribly clear timetable to how do we open up again, nor does there seem to be a very clear timetable to how do we go back to what I'd call a rules-based order. Okay? And again, that's not saying the politicians are rule breakers, but it's how do we go back to essentially doing things in a rational scientific way. And maybe it's impossible, right? Maybe in a world of Twitter and pile-ons and so forth, maybe it's simply not possible because the costs of doing things in that way are too hard. That's not my specialty as to why those things happen, right? But that seems to me to be going forward the big uncertainty. If I was an entrepreneur, I'd be really worried about this sort of thing happening again because there doesn't seem to be any timetable to a return to normal approaches to decision making.
Thank you, John. All right, we are going to wrap, so another round of applause for Professor John Gibson.